Really honored to introduce our speaker today, and I'm going to introduce him in a very professional manner by giving his background, but then I also want to put a little bit of my 2 cents in my experience with Robert. So after transferring with credentials in history and anthropology from Langara College, Robert Jago received a bachelor's degree in political science from Simon Fraser University. He has extensive experience in Indigenous governance and entrepreneurship. Robert has served as a member of the Kwantlen First Nations Lands Advisory Committee, co-owner of Focus Careers, founder and board member of the Coast Salish History Project, and founder of Knowledge Keeper. Robert has tremendous expertise as a historian, journalist, and writer. For example, he served as a historian and writer with Indigenex and wrote articles for, you ready for this list? The Guardian, Walrus, Maclean, CBC, Globe and Mail, National Post, The Nation, National Observer, Media Indigena, The Line, Policy Options, Ottawa Citizen, Canadian Geographic, and the Tyee. Additionally, Robert is the creator, researcher, writer, and former co-host of the Pretendians podcast. Robert has been serving as Indigenous Journalist in Residence at KPU since January of this year. During his time here, he has visited many classrooms, and I just learned that he actually has more classrooms to attend to over the next couple of weeks. Hosted many gatherings and worked closely with our journalism department. I can tell you from personal interactions and communications with Robert that he has taken this opportunity to conduct research, but most importantly, spread knowledge. Today is bittersweet for me because I'm honored to be introducing Robert and listening to him speak as an Indigenous knowledge keeper and educator. Somebody who I've actually learned quite a bit from, and I'm very proud to be introducing him, but it's bitter for me because this is the second last event that Robert is going to be speaking at KPU. So I just want to put a side note here that I've been working closely with Robert, and he is an exceptional knowledge keeper. And it's been an honor to learn from you, Robert. And with that, I would like to welcome Robert Jago.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. I will speak very quickly because I know everybody has busy lives. So my name is Robert Jago. I am from the Kwantlen First Nation and Nooksack Indian tribe. And I am here to talk about land acknowledgements. This type of meeting where you have somebody who's done a whole bunch of research and is presenting it to you in Hunkaminam is called a snowile, that word there. In Pidgin English, it would be translated as teachings, but I think the better term is symposium. And this is going to be snowile on the Chechitzel code. So Chechitzel is a word in the Skagit language, and we'll explain what that means in a minute. Now, normally we would begin this sort of event with a land acknowledgement. In this case, we're going to do that at the end. If you are attending online, we're not going to be able to take any online questions at this event. However, my email will appear at the end, so please email me and I will reply to all of your questions about the presentation. So, some basic vocabulary to begin with, just to orient ourselves. The first word is Huamak, which is the Coast Salish people. This presentation, everything I'm talking about here, is focused on the Coast Salish people, the Huamak people. I can't speak for anyone else. So if you are watching, especially watching online, and are assuming that I'm talking directly about your people, I am not. I'm talking about these people, The next word is Lalam, which is Longhouse, the seat of government and faith, and where you live, in the Huamak world, in the Coast Salish world. And Chechitzel is a word, again, from the Skagit language, and it refers to Lalam property law, and we'll explain what that means momentarily. One more bit of orientation, some key concepts to get across to understand what we're talking about. First off is anarchism, which is the system of government that we had here pre-contact. There's no centralized state, no big powerful chief. Chief is a mistranslation. And no very big powerful enforcement tools from the state. Next thing is property. The Coast Salish, the Hwalmuk conception of property rights is much more robust than Western conceptions. Every piece of land here is owned, every piece of water here is owned, for example. Lastly is the class system. The Hwalmuk people had a very strict class system, going from the upper class elites to a middle class of wealthy landowners to peasants to slaves. That'll come into effect in a minute. So when we talk about land acknowledgements, part of what I'm doing here is showing you where they come from. Now, there are two common theories that you'll find about the origin of land acknowledgements when you look into literature, when you see what people are saying. There is one school of thought that says land acknowledgements are a 21st century innovation, something that happened after the TRC in 2015, and that came out of guilt and came out of an effort at reconciliation. The problem with that is the timeline just does not match with reported experience. Reported experience of land acknowledgements goes back into the 1980s at a minimum. The other thing that I've seen coming primarily out of the United States is that land acknowledgements come from an Australian practice called Welcome to Country. The Welcome to Country ceremonies, the first of those that we see is 1973, so the timeline is a bit better, but it defies logic that this practice from Australia would seep into academia, cross over to academia in the United States, and in a matter of a couple of years, filter down to Indigenous communities. With no disrespect to academia, you don't have that big an audience on res. So that begs the question, where do land acknowledgements come from? So I have a hypothesis. This hypothesis is based on a ton of research. So over the last year, at the request of the BC Humanists, who asked me to look into this, I conducted an extensive literature review of any academic work on this. I looked at contemporary reporting. I dug into the archives. I did interviews with knowledge keepers. I had discussions with academics, discussions with community members, did firsthand observations. I spoke to Indigenous leaders such as Chief Kim Baird, who I believe was big mucky muck around here, Kelsilem of Squamish, Fern Gabriel, who's probably responsible for every bit of hunkaminam on this building, Keith Orr Carlson at University of Fraser Valley. I dug into archival interviews with Joe Louis of Nukthak. I looked at reports from incidents that happened at Keats, Skagit, Cowichan, Nooksack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this comes together, all of these data points allows me to pose a hypothesis based on this information. That hypothesis is that land acknowledgements come from here and are a westernized adaptation of a law known throughout the Coast Salish, the Hwalmuk world, called the Chechitzel Code. So, the Chechitzel Code. This is not a happy scene here. The Chechitzel Code can be, you can determine the shape of it by induction, looking at all of the different reports. And from that, you determine that this code, practiced throughout the entire Coast Salish world, includes that all property and resources are privately held by the upper class. This is an important distinction between our class system and the Western class system. In the Western class system, you focus a lot on capital accumulation, on getting richer, but you miss the second part of it that we include, which is about earning social license. In order to maintain your system for a very long time, you need to have social license. You need to have the people buy into it. You need to make sure that everybody has something to eat. And we do that, or our previous system did that. Actually, we still do that. So in order to do that, we built a system of wealth distribution. We created structures and forms for it that take the form of the Chechitzel Code, so that even though everything is privately owned and privately held, all the important resources, everybody has access to them at request. Now, access is free at absolutely no cost to close family members. It comes with a cost for more remote connections and is only denied to people who are very distant and further away. When you make a request under the Chechitzel Code, you state your relationship, you state what you want to use, and you state for how long. And if you break any of those rules, or if you refuse to make a request under the code, then any nobleman, any lord or lady of the land, if they catch you, they put you to death on sight and bury you there. Now, given the population density of this region and the length of time here, I can say with 100% certainty that each and every one of you in this room has walked at some point on the grave of somebody who broke this law. Now, in practice, what do you use the Chechitzel Code in practice? Well, pre-contact, post-contact, even to today, you use it to request access to a fishery. You use it to request access to a hunting ground, to cranberry fields, and Katesy, for example, was a prominent example. You use it to request permission to enter a village. You thank hosts for entrance into a longhouse. These are all common rote uses of the Chechitzel Code, and as was done in the past, it's still done without interruption today. Now, if we're talking about the transmission of an ancient practice to today, we need to deal with how it got here, and how did this ancient pre-contact practice get to here and become land acknowledgements? Because for Native people, there are two very big events that happened between then and now. The first was the apocalypse, and the second was the period of the Dark Ages. Now, our Dark Ages are a little bit different from yours. You were here for it. They were considered the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and into the early 50s, until the Indian Act reforms lifted a lot of the more serious forms of repression. Now, during this period, everything was legal, everything was banned, our culture was completely suppressed. That's what they intended. Here in the Coast Salish world, the response was twofold. One was to go underground. So our most important ceremonies, they continued underground in secret. But then also, we did something that I don't think many other people did. And that is, we took our culture, we took some of our most important ceremonies, and we turned them into performances. And we turned them into performances, and then we sold them to you, and we charged tickets. And we collected money. And we did that so that we can continue to practice our culture and our way of life in plain sight. So we were not breaking the rules, we were just participating in capitalism. The example you see on the screen is from Sasquatch Days up in Harrison Lake. It's an amazing example how they held on to some of the most important masks by using them as costumes and saying they're costumes. What this did for us was to protect our culture. What it did for you, for non-natives, was to create a culture of ceremonial welcomes. So if you had the king visiting, you would trot out the local Indians and they would do a ceremonial welcome. If you had your World's Fair, you had the Indians come on and do their ceremonial welcome. So I'm sure you've seen ceremonial welcomes around here. That comes from this culture, that comes from that period of oppression. And this is going to be important in a minute because it relates to transmission. Now, once that Dark Ages, that period of the Dark Ages ended with the Indian Act reforms in the 1950s, we still had a lot of conservatism in Indian band offices and tribal offices. Though that was the residential school generation still, they were raised to hate Native people. If you have any family that were at residential school, they're not pleasant. To be honest, my grandma was the worst. But I mean, love to her and everything, but it's rough. And a lot of that is because it's what they were told. They were told to hate Native people, hate everything Native. And so in that role, they did a lot themselves to suppress First Nations culture. You can find letters from chiefs reporting on their people, for example. Now that started to wane throughout the 60s. And by the 1970s, in 1980s, we started to see a period of revitalization of the culture as that generation gave way to another one that had a little bit more pride in their people. So the culture that continued in private, in family longhouses, in secret private ceremonies, started to slowly come to the surface. Now, before this period, pre-contact, there was a lot of interaction between different First Nations along the coast here in the Coast Salish world. And that had to do with a lot of our faith and a lot of trade. And that was done by canoe. To revitalize that culture, there was an event that took place in 1989 called the Paddle to Seattle. Now, numerous informants who I've spoken to about this topic point to the Paddle to Seattle as a seminal event in how the Chechitza Code became the land acknowledgement. Because during the Paddle to Seattle, natives from across the coast restarted the canoe culture, and they canoed as bands to Seattle. At each place they stopped, they came ashore and they asked permission. They performed a Chechitza ceremony. But they weren't doing it just to a single family or a single longhouse. They weren't doing it in secret. They're doing it in public, and whole communities would come out to greet them, including the chiefs. And as they did it, the chiefs, for the first time, started doing these welcomes and these permission grantings and these introductions on behalf of the band. And from that Chechitza practice of permission seeking and welcomes crossed over from our suppressed culture over to the chief class, over to the band government. And by the time you get into the 1990s, anytime any band met another band in any form of meeting, not just a canoe meeting, but meeting to talk about land, meeting to talk about treaty rights, meeting to talk about anything, they performed these Chechitza rights. They performed this form of acknowledgement. At the same time, Native government started to have more interaction with non-Native government and non-Native institutions. Now, the informants that I've spoken to identified the Musqueam connection with UBC and their close and heavy interactions as the likely source where this ceremony, this type of thing, crossed over. Now, remember, these people that we're dealing with, these non-Natives, are already accustomed to bringing Natives in for welcomes. They already have that gene in them that is willing to connect with this. And so when these people from UBC, from wherever, saw at a meeting of Natives, saw these people giving these acknowledgements, these permission requests, they instantly adopted them themselves. And it's at that point, around the early 1990s, that transmission occurred. So we have the transmission from our traditional Chechitza code to the band Chechitza practice to non-Native practice. And that is what gave birth to the land acknowledgement. So going back to my hypothesis that these things came here, that the land acknowledgements originated here. So on balance, it's probably correct. This is consensus of those I've spoken to. It's more likely than the alternative explanation. It passes the Occam's razor test versus the alternative that practice of Australia or Ottawa filtered retroactively back through time to First Nations communities and band offices. So we have a clearly defined pre and post-contact cultural practice. We have non-Indigenous people primed to receive it. We have witness testimony for how it transferred over. And we have a timeline that fits with observation. Now, that's, I think, conclusive proof that this ancestral law, the Chechitza Code, is the origin of the modern day land acknowledgement. It fits every test. It passes every test. Now, for a little bit of a turn, now we need to talk about how land acknowledgements are actually used and how they're actually practiced. Now, there's two things. There is cultural appreciation, which is good. It's green. That's a Canuck, and I totally know who that is. I'm just not saying it. Wearing the Haida hat that they wear at the end of the game if they got the first basket. And next to it are some fans of the Atlanta Braves or Cleveland Indians or whomever, or whatever. You could, so there's cultural appreciation and there's cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is bad. Yeah, cultural appropriation is when you adopt something from another culture and you make it your own. It's totally fine to take things to participate in other cultures the way that the other culture is intended to be. It's a different thing to make your taco out of white bread. So I want you to look at that phrase, making it your own, because that probably sounds familiar to some of you who have looked at land acknowledgements before. They always tell you to make it your own. Now, land acknowledgements, this is my second hypothesis. Land acknowledgements have been culturally appropriated by allies in the name of meaning. What do people say about land acknowledgements? A lot of the criticism is that they're meaningless, is that they're performative, that they're rote, and that they need to mean something to be real. So let's talk about our history and our feelings. Let's bake that all into the land acknowledgement to give it real meaning. Now, here's why that's bad. Besides being cultural appropriation, it comes from here. So where does that come from? Not why is that bad? Where does it come from? That need to inject meaning into the land acknowledgements comes from a Christian cultural bias. There are two broad types of belief and culture. One is based in orthopraxy, and the other is based in orthodoxy. So orthopraxy is when you do the thing. So orthopraxy means you pray to the east, you wear your kirpan, you keep kosher, you do the thing. Our cultures are orthopraxic. We do the thing. Now, other cultures, for example, Western culture, is orthodox. You have to let Jesus into your heart. You have to find Jesus. It's about your belief and feelings. So while we do the thing, you feel the thing. You don't bedazzle your kirpan. You don't add your own sixth pillar to Islam, and you don't modify your land acknowledgement, but you do in a form of appropriation. So I ask you, in light of this, when you say that the acknowledgement has no meaning, that it's performative, what is that about? Well, that comes from this. That means that comes from a Christian cultural bias. It comes from a spirit of appropriation, where you want to take this actual thing that exists, that has been part of Indigenous culture, for Kwalma culture for a very long time, and to modify it and to make it yours. Now, when you are talking about, when you are doing a land acknowledgement, it's very important to not talk about stolen land. Don't make it your own. You have to understand that this thing, now that we know where it comes from, we can prove that it is Walmart law, Coast Salish law. It's our culture, our ways on our territory. Knowing where it is from, knowing that by doing this, that you are following our sovereign laws on our sovereign land, that is the meaning. The meaning isn't your feelings. The meaning is the practice. The meaning is that you are doing the thing. There have been a lot of times, and I'm not going to say that any have been here, but they have been, where I've heard very long, heartfelt, emotional, guilt-filled land acknowledgements. And throughout the whole thing, I just sit there cringing. And all I want to say is, sir, this is a Wendy's. So if you want to do it correctly, I will take you back to the Chechitzel Code. If you are doing a land acknowledgement correctly, you want to identify yourself, explain your connection, declare your intentions, define the duration of the thing that you're going to be doing here, and then don't break your word. We're not going to kill you on the spot and bury you there anymore. But, I mean, we will roast you on social media. So if you want to see what it looks all planned out, it looks like this. This is what an actual authentic Chachitzel compliant land acknowledgement would look like. For example, the ancestral laws of this land require that anyone who is not from one of the host nations needs to make a declaration before doing any work here. My name is Jane Doe. I am from Delta, BC, and my family is from the Netherlands and Tunisia. I'm here on the lands of the Kwantlen Nation to teach math for this semester. I'm thankful to the Kwantlen Nation who are hosting us and allowing us to do this work on their territory. It's nothing about guilt, it's nothing about feelings, because that's not the place for it. This is an orthopraxic practice. This is how you do it and how you're meant to do it. And anything else is cultural appropriation and bad. So that is all of it. If you have any questions, especially online people, about this, please email me here at robert.jago@kpu.ca, and I am open to questions in the room. Yes, the blurry person in the back.
Here, and thank you so much for this very informative talk. Hello, everyone. What is, I guess, my question, because you presented this as like, okay, so this correct practice of land acknowledgement to be done here, but what is your take on land acknowledgements that are done in other territories? Like, I'm originally from the Aran-Wanda territory in what is called Quebec. Like, they're done across the country, those land acknowledgements. So what do we do?
I would say that Native people can culturally appropriate from other Native people. And I suspect that's what that is. I don't know of an Indigenous, I mean, I lived in Quebec, so I've actually spoken to people here. I don't know of a Wendat practice that actually matches this. So I would probably interrogate them and see what is authentic for there. If you are doing this just there, understand that it is a form of appropriation. If the Wendat people would like to continue to do that, that's their choice to do this as some novel innovation. But understand it's a bit appropriating. Yes.
Okay. Hi. So with that in mind, so I just want to clarify. So land acknowledgements, according to your hypothesis, as in fact, it stems from the Coast Salish.
Mm-hmm.
And so taking the land acknowledgement outside of this area, that's the appropriation piece?
No, modifying it outside of this area is the appropriation piece.
Modifying.
If they want to, if a First Nation in another region wants to take our thing and do it, understanding that it's our thing, feel free. But if you're taking our thing and then modifying it and claiming it as yours, it's not quite as good.
One more question, follow up.
And but I should say that, like, our culture is not very, I mean, our culture is not portable. It is extremely different from other cultures. I don't know of very many others in Canada that have this much, that make property so central to their identity. So it seems an awkward fit.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's part of my follow-up question. To your knowledge, is there someone else who has their own hypothesis around where land acknowledgements? Did anyone else study it as in-depth as you did somewhere else in Canada?
No, no. The work that I've seen as part of literature review, it seems to be superficial and doesn't go much past the TRC. There is the stuff in Australia, which is from Australia. The way it's described in the literature makes me very suspicious that it's a hippie thing. But I am open to learning more and seeing. If you're ever reading something about Native people and it says, this is an Indigenous thing that they do there, that's nonsense. This is a Coast Salish thing. This is a Mohawk thing. That makes sense. But once they start saying Indigenous thing, I start thinking hippies. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jeff Myers. I'm in the criminology department. Thanks so much. I really found that to be interesting to talk. One thing I guess I've always had as a practice, and I think it partly comes from my own formation as a lawyer and as in having a legal education, and then doing my research in law schools and teaching there for some time before coming here and teaching in criminology, was that the function of the territorial acknowledgement was actually a quite political and ideological one, as well as one to signal some underlying questions about the moral, legal, political legitimacy of the claim to sovereignty by the Crown and Right of Canada or the Crown and Right of British Columbia, to suggest that there had been people, and that the typical language was living and having complex societies, legal regimes of their own for millennia prior to the arrival of settler colonial peoples. And that were we to carry on with class without acknowledging that the social contract that we believe was universal, sacrosanct, and beyond reproach, that we would somehow be carrying on or perpetuating an ongoing form of erasure of the historical reality of First Peoples across Canada. So that was why I was doing it. And I just want to understand if that project is something separate from territorial acknowledgement altogether, should be jettisoned. That's what I'm curious for your thoughts on.
I don't think that a lot of First Nations here believe that we've been erased. So when we talk about our traditional territories, and sometimes people will say that these territories are stolen. I have worked with Indigenous government that enforces laws throughout the entirety of our territories. I have seen profits come in from resources drawn off reserve from within our territories. We still use all of our territories. There was no point in our history where a single government owned every single parcel of land in our territory. So maybe other people own it, but our sovereignty is still exercised in a very real sense everywhere within our territory. With the territorial acknowledgement, it fits in with that ideology versus one rooted in loss. It's one rooted in the forceful assertion of sovereignty, I think. So that one rooted in loss, I think that may be better reflect what you see with Eastern nations, where their colonial ties are much longer, much deeper. Here, we're only 6 generations since contact. And we still are holding on to quite a bit more, and we're quite a bit more forceful than they are elsewhere. So what they need to do and what that comes from is different than what we need to do, I think. Any other questions?
Thank you, Robert. Very insightful. Given the close connection between property and land and these acknowledgements, how would that play out in, for example, online meetings across Canada, and whether it should be used in those sort of settings where, in some ways, one of you may be on that space, but only one of you, and it's a lot of it's taking place in the ether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really don't know what to do for that. I mean, what resources are you using? What work are you doing? I mean, okay, you're doing work. So principle is you're coming in there and you're using a valuable resource. Oh, bandwidth? Light? For me, I have never done one. I don't necessarily know the meaning of doing that. I would say that if you are representing an institution and you're hosting a meeting on behalf of an institution, then I think it would be sensible to do one there. But if you are hosting an interdepartmental meeting between a whole bunch of people from a bunch of different, I wouldn't bother. You're not, I mean, the only thing you're using is light. So I don't, you know, I mean, we own a lot of stuff, but we don't own light. So I think that might be okay to skip that. Yes.
Hi, Robert Meddy from History. I am electrified by this. This is so fascinating. I think, I don't know, at least for some of the people in my row, I feel like this is totally new and extremely exciting information to learn about. And I really want to thank you for sharing that with us today. And I also wonder if you have plans to share it more broadly.
Yes, to the people online who have asked me to produce this. I have finished it and am annotating it, and will have it to you very shortly. And once it's out there, then I will have permission to release it more broadly. And that's much lengthier. It's like 40 pages of stuff. Any other questions? Are we? Yes.
Hi, Robert. Oh, geez, really loud. Jen Hardwick, English. Nice to see you again.
Yes.
Thank you for this fantastic talk. I learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the 40 pages. Don't you hate it when people say that too? Sorry, it's extra pressure. But I'm curious in your research if you've looked at or thought about land acknowledgement versus acknowledgement of land. When I lived on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territories, one of the things that was talked about a lot is starting with acknowledgement of land, like acknowledgement of creation as a practice, which functions very differently than, kind of the settler land acknowledgement that you're talking about, but is a practice in many nations and communities. And I'm wondering if you looked at that at all, or about, I guess, the distinction between the two or the different kinds of practices there.
I have another theory that there are people, there are certain First Nations that are very obsessed with land and have a whole bunch of practice around that. And we're not really one of those people. I mean, we have monuments throughout here. We have this rock is important. This site here is important. But for the most part, land changes all the time. Here, I was doing work for the Patello project. And when I was looking at the Patello Bridge, when we go back into the soil long enough, that's the ocean front, because everything else in front of that, the rest of Vancouver and Richmond and Delta was not there. That was newly created land. Land here changes all the time. For the Kwantlen home island, the shore changes. We have a neighboring island that pops up, disappears, pops up, disappears, depending on the season. Land here is not permanent. It's a source of change. We don't call ourselves anything based on land. Our ethnicity is the Stala. We're river people. We're about water. We're about change. So our culture and our practice and our ideology is about change. Think about who our gods are. They're all transformer gods. They're all changing form and shape all the time, like the land and the world around us itself does. So for us, like the category of acknowledgement of land, as opposed to a land acknowledgement, it's not a category that fits, I think, with our worldview, because our worldview is about the water and about movement and change and transformation all the time. And we do have ceremony for water. There's one that's happening on the 16th. It's closed to the public, but it's our annual ceremony where we return the salmon bones to the water, for example. So we have a lot around that, but we don't, do that Mohawk stuff.
Thanks. And just a quick follow-up, I guess I'm wondering, in terms of the idea of a territorial acknowledgement coming from these territories, are you expecting, I guess, complexity based on the fact that many other nations acknowledge territory, again, not necessarily in this way, but more like acknowledge creation as an opening practice or as an introductory practice?
If that's what they do, more power to them. Good luck with the courts on that. One of the things that I was intending to do with this research is just show whether this practice of territorial acknowledgements was that. was about, was faith-based and religion-based. And so I think it was important to discover and to show and to prove that it is actually based in property relations and based in law.
Thank you so much. Again, really, really fascinating work.
Thanks. Anything else? All good. Cool. Well, thank everybody for, thank you all for coming. And yes, please feel free to click away. So thank you very much. Nice to see you.